Second learning, I would say, is power of storytelling. And designers especially are equipped to do this better than anyone else, right? So one of the things that we did for YouTube Kids is we created product story video. And the motivation for creating this was we were having these back and forth conversations with various people in the company around what's the best way to design this experience, right? And the design strategists that partnering with came up with this idea of hey, what if we tell this in the form of a story? It was almost like creating an ad for the product before it was built, right? And showcasing how the product fits into people's lives using real examples. We created a product story video. It was a very low fidelity video. We took in pictures of a real family in a real household environment and put in mocks of screens, how a kid-friendly experience designed from the ground up could fit into this family usage of YouTube. And by the end of watching this 2-minute video, people's mindset would completely change and got a lot of adoption. It was watched by 2,000 people within the company. And the conversation shifted from the arguments around the nuances or the numbers or the spreadsheets and the documents where we would list out the pros and cons and so on into something more human, more relatable. Just product story helped achieve that shift in conversation.
Welcome to Design Drives, your audio experience about what, how, and why design drives things forward. A podcast hosted by Sebastian Gier, together with forward-thinking design practitioners from around the world.
In this episode at UX India, I talk with Shiva Jaini, who is a product design manager at Google during the UX India conference in Hyderabad. We talk about why and how design drives intrapreneurship, so basically internal entrepreneurship. Shiva has been quite successful doing exactly that during his time at Google, driving efforts like YouTube Kids from an idea to an actual product internally, and then joining an internal incubator to invent new experiences and services on the base of the Google Assistant voice in the kitchen area, where we talk a bit about the importance of designing contextually and using a multi-modal interaction design approach. These days he's a product design manager for transportation and urban mobility systems at Google, and he shares his insights on how design can be a driving force for new innovations and product experiences by creating confidence and visions. So enjoy. So I'm here with Shiva Jaini, who's a product design manager at Google, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're excited to speak to you.
Same here.
So we have a lot of interesting topics that we touch on, and we're going to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, about your work at Google, some of your work you did before Google.
Yeah.
Maybe to give the audience a little bit of context about your background and how you got into design in the first place, and coming from India.
Yeah.
So maybe you can share that.
Sure. Yeah, I think my entry into design was somewhat of a happy accident. So I was looking at what programs to get into for my undergrad, and I was preparing for getting into the IITs, Indian Institutes of Technology, and I came across this undergrad program in design. So this is at IIT Guwahati. It's in the northeast part of India, and I've never heard of design before. Yes, but when I looked at the program description, it had things like product design, visual communication, and animation, and being offered in a technological institute. And I got curious, so I learned a bit more. Then, because it was one of the only undergrad programs at the time, I thought I was somewhat taking a bit of risk. But I went with it, and there was no looking back from there.
Yeah.
I loved in general, empathizing with people and understanding their needs and solving problems, that we would discover from talking to them and understanding them and so on. So I love that aspect about, a design, which gets to, at its essence, it's about problem solving through almost a scientific process, right? And I think the undergrad program also had a great influence, right? The people I was exposed to and, the professors and the curriculum was very unique in the way it was set up. So all of that like shaped my worldview of things. I think having that strong foundation to look at problems from a holistic point of view, looking at it from every angle, right? Think about problems from technology standpoint, from a business standpoint, but then at the essence of it, like how does solution like address the the core needs of the people. So all of those, I think, like strong foundations were laid during that undergrad program, and I then like further continued my master's in human-computer interaction after my undergrad program, and from then on, I've been working in the tech industry.
Was that in India as well? You were
So
graduating?
the master's was at Georgia Tech in the US, and
So that was the time you transitioned to the US.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And it was also a very interdisciplinary program. So the human-computer interaction program was coordinated across like 3 schools: College of Computing, Information Design and Technology, and the School of Psychology. So it had all aspects that I was talking about earlier on behavioral sciences, technology.
And then, what was your first internship after your graduation? Or did you already did some, internship during your studies?
Yeah. So during my undergrad program, I did an internship, T-Systems in Berlin.
Berlin.
Yeah. So it was actually like, it was in 2007, but even at that time, we were looking at how can AR experience help influence commerce.
Okay. When was that? What year was it?
It was in 2007.
2007.
Yeah. So the tech or the prototype that we were building was you take a picture of your living environment and we would insert products in that picture or video that you take in a photorealistic way for you to visualize how the product that you purchase could look in the real world. So at that point it was more of a research project, but now it's more of a reality, right?
Yeah,
like with AR abilities on all your phones, you can actually fulfill that in a very easy way. Kind of talks about like how long it can take like for new technologies to become mainstream.
Absolutely. Yeah. So then you did internship at T-Systems, right? In Berlin, right? And then what were some of your other experiences after graduation?
And during my master's, I did an internship at Yahoo Research. That was my first exposure to mobile technology and
They were working on mobile?
Yeah.
It was on the mobile applications, not the web. Which I assume to that time it was mostly web was the main product, right?
Correct. Yeah.
But you worked on mobile there already.
Yeah. So Georgia Tech was part of the mobile technologies group where we were looking at location-based applications around like discovering of places nearby and so on. But this was all like developing stuff for like your Nokia devices, which had like significantly low capabilities compared to the first iPhone, for example.
Yeah.
But all of those learnings since like the path I've taken afterward. After graduation, I joined Yahoo, and then at Google as well. So I think like everything, looking back, were like stepping stones and like great learning experiences that I was able to build on top of each other.
So when did you join Google?
In 2011. So 2011. It's been 8.5 years now, I guess.
So and we already chatted a little bit about that before. I think what was super interesting was the experiences you had at Google so far.
Yeah.
You came into YouTube, right?
Correct.
And then you worked, I don't know if did you work directly on YouTube Kids or was that happening after?
No, so I was working, I first joined as the, first designer on YouTube ad experiences, thinking about consumer-facing ad experiences and defining like the principles around like how we design like video ads and making them. So as the, a designer of the skippable ad experience, making it, and we called it like True View in the sense that, YouTube we have this interesting balancing act that we need to do among the needs of creators who are uploading content and their need to make money for, the content that they're creating and sustain themselves. And for end users who are consuming the content, making it as less disruptive as possible with ads. For advertising partners to create like a quality bar for them, right? And TrueView was a really interesting solution that balanced all these needs and motivated like advertisers to create or engage the audience in the first 5 seconds. And, the advertiser would get charged only if like end user watches through the entire ad, right?
If he doesn't skip after 5 seconds, basically, right?
Correct. Yeah. So it was an interesting experience, like, thinking about this balancing act and how do you define principles in a way that doesn't cause frustration for end users. And yet, content creators are able to monetize the content that they're, putting there.
You have to give them certain guidelines as well, right?
Yeah,
design
absolutely.
guidelines and so on. So
Yeah.
it's super interesting.
Yeah. And then while I was doing this, I was also, interested in exploring the potential of YouTube in the space of education and enrichment. And I was doing this like, at Google, like you have this 20% time that you can spend on, projects that excite you. So I was devoting 20% of my time towards that effort. And YouTube Kids kind of like was born from that, 20% experience. We were looking at, hey, if you think about education and like, enrichment through content, there is a wide spectrum of users who consume this type of content. And we thought like it's best to, pick a segment of users and focus on, meeting those needs of those users, right? So we ended up focusing on like young kids for whom like the content was exploding. And that was like the origins of like YouTube Kids. And I ended up like shifting 100% of my time towards, pitching and getting the leadership buy-in and investing. Like I shifted like from working on ad experiences to completely focus on
afterward opening up as a complete product, right?
Yeah, correct.
So was that really driven by you, or did you found other fellows who you pitched them to and they jumped in? I assume so, right?
Yeah. So there were two others.
Engineering and
Yeah, so initially there were two others. One was a colleague who was a design strategist. He came from IDEO. Okay. Then another is a product management director that we work very closely with. It was pretty much like the three of us initially.
All designers then, right? So you said like a product manager as well, right?
Correct. And, once we were able to get the leadership buy-in, like then, the team expanded quite fast and we got like all types of, leaders come in and work on the product. Yeah. But initially, like the early days, it was just the, three of us trying to make a case for building a standalone product, essentially.
Yeah, it's such a common behavior you see with people, right? That or parents that give the smartphone to their kids, right? And open YouTube. And so I wonder a little bit about the design process there. Like, did you speak to parents? Like, how did you came up with the principle? Like, how do you need to redesign YouTube so it fits for that specific user group, right?
Yeah.
And then also, I think parents have their constraints on that as well, right? They just certain content, and so I'm wondering. I think the design process there.
Yeah, I think So actually, my talk tomorrow, I'm going to be talking more some of the more specific steps and details around the design process, YouTube Kids, and some of the other projects. But I think like at a high level, as you said, like, engaging with parents and kids to understand their, desires and aspirations and needs around like their kids' consumption of YouTube was a core part of like the design process. And one of the methods we use quite a bit is co-design methods. So we would do co-design sessions with parents, we would do co-design sessions with kids to get inspiration as to like what is it that families are looking for in an ideal like experience for them. And using all these insights that we would gather from these co-design sessions, we developed like some design principles. And in terms of like design challenges, there were quite a few. But then I can probably mention two of them. One of them I'd say is the product. We were trying to cater the experience to a wide range of kids. And what we realized is, the interests and abilities of a 3-year-old is vastly different from what a 9-year-old would want in terms of content preferences or experience preferences, and also abilities. So, if you think about like a 3-year-old, even a 5-year-old, it's really hard for them to read text and, type in a query, for example. So voice as an input mechanism was something, we've prioritized quite a bit.
Did you enable it via touch, or how did you prioritize voice?
Yeah.
Because it's not a core interaction principle of YouTube, right? So,
Right.
So we had like a button there to people could speak instead of type, right?
Correct. Yeah. And then we would also like make the default experience very content and visual rich. We've stripped down as much text as possible from the experience, right? Like, because like for this age group of kids, like even the ones like who are able to read, like 7-year-olds.
Slow probably.
Yeah, exactly. And so we made like visual richness of the content shine and come through the UI. And then the second challenge I would say is, parents, as you said, like parents' expectations and needs are different from the kids. And so for us, like it was really important to create a product that was responsible and well thought out in terms of explaining to the parents how the app works and explaining to them like what kind of controls they have to customize the experience to their needs and values and so on, right? So it was important like for us to not just design the controls, but also make them easily understandable like for parents so that they set it up right way for their kids. And when it comes to these like the age differences of kids, right? Like one of the principles we came up with is this thing called a grow up to experience, wherein like the interface or the experience would adapt as kids grow and their abilities grow. So, the way we present the content or the actions that you can take as a kid, like would adapt as kids' interests and abilities change.
Super interesting. I wonder a little bit about the process, the internal process, of entrepreneurship. And how does it? Maybe you as a designer, you had 2 designers working on it and 1 product manager. So it was quite design driven.
Yeah.
And some people are like designer driven.
Yeah.
So how was it to being a designer and trying to push such a project forward? And I guess it helps to have a project manager also on site, right?
Yeah.
Because he has maybe some other connections, to get people involved and
right.
So how's that? How did that process like? And maybe how did your background in design help you? Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was overall like a very powerful learning experience for me. Like the process of like pitching, getting the buy-in, and then actually like making progress on it. This entire process of like YouTube Kids origin was offered a lot of like learning experiences for me. And I'd say like, I'd stress on like maybe 2 things that I learned around like the role of design in influencing
entrepreneurship
and getting the buy-in and so on, right? Like one is this, going or approaching the problem with a beginner's mindset. I think it's really important, right? Like as designers or in general, like as a team, when you're trying to design something for a new set of users or a new market or a new problem space, to go with a design, beginner's mindset. And it's always a challenge because, in our case, like for people who had kids of themselves, you would have preconceived notions and assumptions around, oh, my kid is able to do these things and universally apply those assumptions and preconceived notions to everyone, right? When you take a beginner's mindset, you kind of like go with a clean slate and you create these principles by talking to actual people, like, average households, average families, right? It can be very different from, very tech savvy family, people who work at Google, on average, are very tech savvy compared to families that don't come from these backgrounds, right? So that was one thing like that helped us like showcase examples of real families, real kids, and, real parents, and make a case for like why thinking from the grounds up with kids in mind, like and designing the experience appropriately makes sense. We were able to show examples. And then the second learning I would say is power of storytelling. And designers especially are like equipped to do this better than anyone else, right? So one of the things that we did for YouTube Kids is we created like product story video. And the motivation for creating this was we were having these like back and forth conversations with various people in the company around like what's the best way to design this experience, right? And the design strategist that partnering with came up with this idea of like, hey, what if like we tell this in the form of a story? It was almost like creating an ad for the product before it was built, right? And showcasing like how the product fits into people's lives using real examples. We created a product story video. It was a very low fidelity video. We took in like pictures of a real family in a real household environment and put in mocks of screens, how a kid friendly experience designed from the ground up could fit into this family usage of YouTube. And by the end of like watching this 2-minute video, people's mindset would completely change and got a lot of adoption. Like it was watched by like 2,000 people within the company.
Oh, wow.
And the conversation shifted from the arguments around like the nuances or the numbers or the spreadsheets and the documents where we would list out the pros and cons and so on into something more human, more relatable. This like product story helped achieve that shift in conversation and getting that buy-in. So I think like for early incubation projects, it's important to paint this picture of what your product will change in people's lives and how your product would fit into people's lives, right? Like, because you could have endless conversations in documents. Then when you visualize it, it's a whole different game altogether.
Yeah, that's a topic that comes over and over up in the podcast about the power of doing or the power of actually giving an idea texture, right?
Yeah.
And then create something for people so they can talk about it. It doesn't have to be the final result, right?
Yeah.
So like you guys did it with the video, right?
Yeah.
You had that, you were equipped to visualize it and make it tangible for people,
right?
And then you have a story to tell, right? And you can present it and people can emphasize with what the actual solution how it would benefit the user. And I think this is a unique skill set of a unique aspect of design. I think the ability to take an idea and make it painted on the wall, right? And then talk about it, and then you can take things further, right? And things like, okay, how does it actually has to look like to make it reality?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's super interesting.
Yeah.
And then this was not your only project you were sort of incubating at Google. I think like afterwards you did work on, I think, the area around like cooking and AI and voice assistant. So what was that story about?
So, I mean, I was at YouTube Kids, like I was working on YouTube Kids for like 3 years. And again, I had that itch to kind of like start something new and take it from, a scratch or zero stage to getting into something like more solid and defined. And fortunately at Google, like there is a startup incubator called Area 120. And I transitioned from YouTube Kids to join Area 120.
Full-time.
Full-time, yeah. And first joined as an entrepreneur in residence without necessarily having a solid idea in mind. I had like a range of ideas.
So you sort of qualified by, entrepreneuring YouTube Kids. Was that your qualification to university, right? To join them, right?
Maybe.
Without any idea, right? Because you said like you were just joining them, but you still had to figure out what the topic is going to be.
Yeah. So I was actually fortunate to be able to join that program in that way. And as I was looking at like a range of ideas, one thing that struck me was, conversational assistants were gaining traction. At that point in time, from a
2015 or
2016?
2016.
Yeah. So smart speakers were out there, Google Home, Alexa speakers, right? And what I realized was, based on my own usage of it, I found from an input-output modality perspective, found just the audio-only interactions quite constraining. And it wasn't like very effective at certain things when you want to, get information at a glance, or when you want to compare options, or when you want to perform a series of tasks. The audio-only input-output was very ineffective and slow. So my hypothesis was, how can we, create audio-visual assistant experiences? And the thinking was, people have, millions of households have tablets that are sitting there collecting dust when they're not being put to use. How can we turn those, tablets into ambient assistants that can sit in your households, right? And can, help you in various contexts. And to limit the scope or focus the scope, we pitched the idea of like picking kitchen as a context And one of the things that I looked at was almost like 50% of the speakers, smart speakers, were already being put in kitchens.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Kitchen is the 50% of the devices.
At that point in time, like
Okay, maybe it changed.
with the audio only experiences, right? And I could also see like myself, like, in the kitchen, like your hands are busy, you're multitasking. So it made a lot of sense like for people to have this assistant in that context. So we focused on that, created this audiovisual kitchen assistant. And I think to go back to your question around like the role of design in creating this kitchen assistant, I would say like from day one, we've been like very ears to the ground, right? Like it was probably like, so we were on this 8-month journey within Area 120, which is the incubator, where almost every single day we were interacting and with the end users, right? So we were like meeting families, we had families testing out our products. It was a very human-centered like a design process we've taken up. And other than me, there were 3 other engineers who were part of the founding team. And for them, it was also fascinating because they're part of these sessions with customers or end users directly, and they would observe the issues firsthand. And by the time we come back to the office, like they already know like what needs to be done. They're already working on like refining the experience and so on. So it was a very interesting experience, very scrappy, very interesting experience. Yeah, I think like, by adopting like this very user-centered approach, I think we've learned a ton around limitations and also how these ambient displays, which are a very new medium, people were engaging with in their households. How should, like, if at all, like there were ambient displays in a home context, how should that experience be? We were able to come up or define principles around those. And one of like the things that came up was how these, ambient displays need to kind of like blend into your home environment, not stand out, be disruptive to where you're living. One like funny incident was like, we had these ambient displays that were on all the time, and we would hear like complaints from people who had pets and how their pets would get like distracted with this light coming out at night time.
Just like look at it.
And the household, like they would just turn off the device altogether, right? Like despite the benefits they were seeing with an ambient display that was surfacing information that might be relevant for them, like knowing when to show, when to hide into the background was an interesting learning. So there were a lot of like these learnings that able to gather during that time. And all these learnings, I think, were super helpful in creating like kitchen assistant that was actionable. It was helpful to do tasks like cooking. So if you find a recipe that you like, being able to act on it. So we were working on like providing like video recipe guidance, taking you through these like step-by-step tasks and answering questions in the context. So with all these learnings, like the Google Assistant team looked at what we have done or accomplished during that period of time. And they essentially acquired our team to kickstart a vertical within the Google Assistant org to focus on kitchen and meals vertical.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Actually, the first guest on Design Drives was the first designer of the Amazon Echo. So we talked a lot about AI and design, about prototyping, the importance of prototyping.
Yeah.
So since you worked also in that space, I'm wondering what are your principles and learning when it comes to designing experiences with AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think with specific to conversational assistants, I can definitely go a bit deeper. I think like with AI, given like the context and the application of it could be like
like regarding, I think the kitchen scenario and the context you worked in.
Okay, sure. So with the assistant and the kitchen context, I think like few of the things that I could talk about are modalities and understanding like users' context.
They're actually cooking at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And also, in general, like kitchen is a communal space where there could be like multiple family members gathering. So designing an ambient display that would cater to the needs of different family members was really key. We didn't like achieve it or like build it in the first instance, but that was something that was thought was an important thing to address. So being able to, when it comes to information needs, if you have kids and like 2 adults or parents in the family, how could like the ambient display, like cater to the different needs that each of these household members might have. Well, it was an interesting design challenge. And I think like the second thing is like when you think about modalities and in general like assistant interactions, one of the principles is we should focus on use cases where assistant is the best way to get things done compared to alternatives, right? If touching is the easiest way to get things done, we could focus on it, or we should prioritize it. But at the same time, in the kitchen context, knowing out of all the modalities like touch, voice, eyes, like visual, what modalities are available at what time, and adapting like the experience so that you take that into consideration. And the second thing is like contextual, right? Like say you're in the middle of cooking a recipe and you ask the assistant how much olive oil. Like the assistant needs to be able to know the context of, oh, this is the recipe you're cooking. This is the amount of olive oil that's specified. And when you say like, what can I replace olive oil with? Like it needs to know for based on the dish that you're cooking, what might be suitable substitutes. Right. So there are all these things like that. We didn't get it like right away, but as we observed, like people using it, right?
Just with the sound.
Right? Yeah. And the other thing was like, one of the use cases that we were focusing on was help me decide what to cook. One of the things
classic, right?
Right. Like, out of all the needs that you have in the kitchen context, this need kind of like bubbled to the top. People like struggle with like coming up with new ideas for what to cook. And, to address this, what we, experimented with was we worked with Google chefs to curate recipe recommendations depending on diet profiles of families. And
so you put us into the canteen. Right?
Pretty much. It's almost so. Our vision was to create this virtual sous chef that takes into account your dietary preferences, your family's household like preferences, and what you might have in your kitchen, the staples, and then recommend dishes, right? And we realized, none of the chef recommendations were working because
you don't have enough data, probably.
It was actually interesting because the families that we were studying with would say actually all the recommendations were relevant for us, but then we can't really act on them because we ran out of those ingredients. Or we don't have them today. So I would like bookmark that recipe and then maybe cook it later. Then one of our goals was like to have an assistant like that would recommend actionable things.
So simple recipes then.
Yeah,
would be actionable. Yeah.
And so one feature that we built was to look at the groceries that you buy and recommend recipes based on the groceries that you buy. So we worked on this feature where you can just scan the receipt from your grocery shopping, your phone, assistant on your phone. And then by the time you get back home, the smart display in your kitchen would recommend recipes based on the things that you just bought.
Interesting.
So
that's
that was
interesting workaround. Because obviously there's a trend around like cameras in fridges and so on.
Right.
But like scanning, And I think if you do it 10 times, you probably have everything you have in stock. Probably.
Exactly. Yeah. But again, we didn't necessarily experiment with that idea at scale. So I think like that scanning piece can still have friction. And if you can link your grocery account or somehow like gather this automatically, that's I think like more powerful than having to scan a receipt. Still expects something that people are not used to doing.
Yeah. You have to sort of get reminded after leaving the grocery.
Exactly.
Maybe you can work with Google Maps. I think what's also interesting now, you actually shift to enterprise again, right?
Right.
So what does excite you about that space? Because that we haven't worked in that space before, right?
It's a whole new world,
sort of, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the shift to enterprise was, not what I thought. Like the thing that excited me most was so right now I work on Google Maps or Geo as a product area. And the vertical that I'm focused on is transportation and urban mobility. So I find this space like super fascinating, especially with all the changes and the rapid innovation that happened over the last like 7-8 years in the world of like transportation and mobility. I think like it's still like this whole industry is in the infancy of transformation, right? But what I find fascinating is the ability to influence how people move, how goods move in real world. But at the same time, it's like I find it like super complex, and it took me quite a bit of time like to understand like factors that influence the markets, the nuances, and of each transportation mode, and how like Google, like we could leverage our expertise to influence how we move and get things done in the world.
Mm-hmm. And can you use some of your, I guess like you can take a lot of your past learnings also.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that work now, right? Even though it's a completely different space.
Yeah. I think like, when designing for enterprises, like this whole aspect of like service design comes into picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how can we enable the transportation operators better serve needs of end users? So it could be backend systems. It could be, the things that end users might not know or see, mm-hmm. but could have a huge implications on like how the end users experience the systems, right? Mm-hmm. So we currently create solutions for ride-hailing industry. Mm-hmm. Then we're also looking at what else we could do with other modes of transportation.
Mm-hmm. And we talked a lot about the difference between B2c and B2b.
Yeah.
So if there would be one learning for you, one takeaway, moving from in that new space, what would it be? As a designer, the role of designer, what does it change like moving into that space?
Yeah, I think with B2C, what I find is like the pace at which you act on the insights that you gather is defined by you, mm-hmm. and you are in control of that. When it comes to B2B, you kind of need to predict, and you need to be ahead of the curve and predicting like what the enterprises or the mm-hmm. Customers might need. And in a world where these enterprises and customers are moving at a fast pace, it's a very competitive landscape. Mm-hmm. How do you identify a set of solutions that you as a company can offer to these customers and get those built in time mm-hmm. to be adopted and provide like meaningful value to these companies? Mm-hmm. I think is a interesting challenge.
Yeah,
I don't think we've cracked it, but it's an interesting design challenge. Mm-hmm.
Maybe to wrap it up, what would be your advice for young people who want to get into design?
I think one of the things I was alluding to earlier, I found myself like super beneficial is this mindset around approaching problems from a holistic point of view. Mm-hmm. So for young designers or young students who want to get into design, I think finding programs or support group or network of people who can kind of like push your thinking and mindset to look at problems from multiple angles and multiple perspectives, I think is going to be very important. And I think, whether you want to get into a specialized role in an area of design, or if you want to, become more of a generalist, this mindset, the holistic thinking mindset, I think will be super important nonetheless, right? Mm-hmm. So that I would say is one advice I would give to young designers. And I think conferences like these, UX India conference or meetups where you get to talk to how people are approaching problems from different angles will help further that skill set and mindset. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So thank you so much for sharing all that.
Absolutely.
Fascinating sense. Thank you.
It was awesome. We're talking about all these topics.
Thank you.
That was the episode. If you want to give us feedback on the podcast, have something to contribute to the next episode, or just want to get in touch, feel free to connect with us either on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram messages, or simply via the designdrives.org website. We love to hear from you.